Hello, everyone. I'm Lauren Singleton, Dean of the Lubin School of Business. I'd like to welcome you to the Dean's Roundtable. Today, we're pleased to have with us as our guest, Ms. Gloria Greco. Until her recent retirement, Ms. Greco was a compliance and operational risk executive at Bank of America Corporation, responsible for overseeing compliance and operational risk for the wealth management businesses, including Bank of America Private Bank, Merrill Lynch Wealth Management, Merrill Edge, Investment Solutions, and Retirement and Personal Wealth Solutions. She began her career with Merrill Lynch, where she held positions within legal, accounting, finance, purchasing, and technology organizations. Her expertise and experience include securities, consumer banking, and fiduciary regulations, intellectual property rights, and contract law, and many, many other areas. She has also held various enterprise and line of business compliance and legal executive leadership roles, where she developed strategy, oversaw group functional activities, engaged with key regulatory authorities, and regularly interacted with executive management, board members, and board committees. Ms. Greco graduated from Pace University's Lubin School of Business, where she earned a BBA in management, and from Brooklyn Law School, where she earned her JD. She has also held various securities industry licenses and formal regulatory designations, including serving as Chief Compliance Officer for Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Finner, and Smith, Incorporated, and other entities. She has a wealth of experience to share with you today. Please welcome Gloria Greco to the Dean's Roundtable. Ms. Greco, I'd like to just begin by asking you to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure, thank you. And I'm really pleased to be here with all of you today. And thank you, Dean, for that nice introduction. I guess the way I would start is telling you that I started my career right out of high school. I had a summer job working at Merrill Lynch. And at the end of the summer, my boss asked me, I was headed toward Hunter College, actually, as part of the CUNY organization. And that was really primarily driven by the fact that my family didn't have a lot of money to help me with my college education. So I had to start at a place where I felt I could afford it, and I had a great, experience there. But about 2 years into my studies at Hunter, my boss came to me and said, if you went to school at night, I could pay your tuition and you could work full time. And I could pay a part of your tuition. Let me put it that way. The company had a tuition reimbursement program. And so I said, well, that sounds great. And, because I was working downtown, I always had, I knew a lot of people that I worked with that had gone to Pace for their undergrad studies. And it was certainly right near where my office was, and had a robust evening program. So that felt like a great fit. And I was very fortunate to be accepted into the program at Lubin, and then pursued the rest of my undergraduate degree through Lubin, with a small sidebar to when my job moved to New Jersey for a while. I actually continued my studies at Rider for a few semesters, but then ultimately came back to Pace and finished up at Pace. And one of the things that was so welcoming and so great about Pace was there was a recognition of my experience working as part of that educational fulfillment and growth that I would have as an undergraduate student. And there was a great program that talked about experiential learning. And so I was able to build on a lot of the real life work experience that I had, and supplement that to enable me to complete my education. So when I finished that, I was still working at Merrill Lynch, and then decided to pursue a law degree, which again, I chose to do at night, and went to Brooklyn Law School, which had, again, a very robust evening program, and again, more of a very practical approach to the study of the law, which appealed to me. And so I pursued my degree at my JD degree at Brooklyn, and was very fortunate to have the opportunity to go work in the legal department at Merrill Lynch, which was something that didn't usually happen, because big companies tend to like to hire lawyers who have spent some time as an associate at a law firm, or worked at a regulatory authority, or some other experience. So I was very fortunate to have some great mentors at Merrill Lynch, and continued there in the legal department, and then moved into the compliance function, got offered an opportunity to take on a role in about 2006 to work in compliance, leading a team, the team that actually oversaw the development of products and services that we offered to wealth management clients. And then after that, I decided that that was my home and really enjoyed being there, and ultimately came to run that group. During the financial crisis, I'm sure many of you know that Merrill Lynch was acquired by Bank of America. And accordingly, my team and I had to adapt to those changes, very different regulatory framework and authority by federal banking regulators, which Merrill Lynch had not been subject to in the same way prior to that. And so we went and made our way through that, and I think really built on top of a lot of really good things that we had, but really built that out further. And so I ended my career after 11 years in a role in and around the wealth management business, but had a number of different functions, sometimes at the enterprise level, meaning things that impacted Bank of America across the company, across the globe. So lots of programs that related to compliance, but were away from the wealth management business. So things like economic sanctions or anti-bribery rules or conflicts laws and things of that ilk. So political law, et cetera. So I had a bunch of experiences in that way. So a lot of stimulation, great opportunities, lots of diversity. I was telling the dean, I spent the first 15 years of my career at Merrill Lynch in finance functions, which served me very well when I was working with our business partners, because it helped me understand, how their business operated and what was important to them, and how different things impacted their business and what their objectives were and so forth. So having that experience, and having my educational experiences at Lubin and at Brooklyn Law really, I felt, helped me a lot in those roles. So that's kind of the nutshell of what my career path was.
Sounds great. Yeah, really, really interesting career. There's no question. Well, let's delve a little deeper if we could. And what I'd like to do is invite the audience to ask questions. You can use the raise your hand function in Zoom. You can place it in the chat. Either way, and we'll get the question right to Ms. Greco. So please don't be shy. Let me start by just asking you one about how we're in the compliance business. How did that change during your career? I know we chatted a little bit about this before we started, but it's really been a really big changes over the years, right?
Yes, absolutely. I guess there's kind of two tracks I would go on. One is the regulatory framework itself that impacted the compliance organizations. And the other was just the positioning of a compliance function in the organization. So just to stick with that one for a second, historically, compliance functions where basically your job is to interpret applicable regulations, work with a business to educate them about what those regulatory requirements are, ensure that they have policies and procedures and programs in place to comply with those rules, and then conduct some independent oversight, usually testing or some other type of monitoring activity to ensure that they are actually complying, that the controls that they have in place are operating effectively. And so naturally, because it involves some interpretation of the law, historically, compliance functions always sat aligned with or underneath the legal department. So the general counsel's office typically is where you would find a lot of compliance personnel. You didn't necessarily need to have a law degree to be in a compliance function. There are lots of different roles that you can be in, but clearly having a law degree or legal education was helpful in terms of understanding the regulatory requirements and so forth and how they're interpreted. So over time, though, and that was really historically in the securities industry. So think of Merrill Lynch as a broker-dealer or an investment advisor, very different than a consumer bank. Like Bank of America has a very robust consumer business, credit cards, mortgages, savings and deposit accounts, vehicle loans, all of those types of things. And then, of course, a commercial bank that lends money to big corporations and others. And so the difference, I would say, this kind of bleeds into my first point, is the difference in the regulatory frameworks are really interesting, and they evolved over time because of the financial crisis and other things. But historically, banking regulators were very focused on the safety and soundness of the bank, of the institution itself that took in deposits, and lent out money. So the whole focus of their regulatory framework was about making sure that the bank is protected so that you're not making loans that are inappropriate or that you've got the right controls around deposit taking and so forth. But it's about preserving the safety and soundness of the bank. On the broker-dealer side and the investment advisor side, it's more client-facing. So the regulatory framework, while it has some aspects that are akin to safety and soundness, because you do take in client assets and other things, you have to make sure that you have the right controls to separate their assets from the company's assets and so forth. But the regulatory framework really is driven by two things: investor protection. So people like us, right, when we're investing in mutual funds or other things, to make sure that our investments are protected and that there's not fraud going on in terms of how someone is representing to you what a particular investment might do or what experience you might have as a holder of those investments. So that's all about investor protection. And then the second side, which really ties a lot to the strength of our economy, is all about the integrity of the marketplace. So people who are buying and selling securities and making sure that whether it's an institutional buyer like a big insurance company or some other a pension fund or some other thing, or it's individual investors like us, that we have comfort and take confidence in the safety and soundness of that market, that it's transparent, that it's clear, that things happen the way they're supposed to, when they're supposed to, et cetera, and that there's good record keeping. So those two regulatory regimes you can see are very different. One is very inward focused around the bank itself. The other is more about its place in the marketplace and how you deal with clients and the impact on clients. So when the financial crisis hit in 2008, all the banking regulators, really, it was a sort of a big wake-up call that they also had to think about the impact on investors, right? And the impact on customers. So if you were making loans to people that they really had no business having because they were, overly leveraged, that's a problem. And that becomes then a safety and soundness problem for the bank. But you can't just sort of let that hang out there. You have to make sure that you have the right controls to ensure that, you're treating customers fairly. And you saw the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was a brand new regulatory authority that its job was to make sure that banks were dealing appropriately with individual clients on banking products. So there is lots of requirements that bank regulators have about how much capital a company can and must maintain and reserve to protect for losses and things like that, which are much higher than the thresholds that securities regulators required of securities firms. So there was a lot, and of course at that time, lots of banks were struggling from a capital perspective because they had loans that were going belly up and not a lot of deposits happening. So it was a very challenging time. So to answer your question, Dean, long story short is there was a big fat focus on compliance across the board by all of the regulators. And it was a little bit of a feeding frenzy because we had, at any given time, 6 or 7 different major federal level regulatory authorities, and then a whole bunch of state regulatory authorities that were also getting in the mix on, ensuring that they were, carrying what they needed to do to meet their charters and their obligations. So the compliance function kind of came out from behind the legal department and became on its own really more of a risk management function, because if you weren't complying, then you would have lots of operational losses. It would go to that safety and soundness issue. You'd have lots of customer issues if you didn't do things appropriately. So the compliance function really kind of had a rebirth and became a much more of a front foot activity versus a back office function. And I think for me, it was very interesting because no 2 days were the same. Things were evolving very quickly. My team and I had to adapt a lot over that time, but we learned a lot, and I feel like we did a lot of good. It really, so now, if you think about it, just about every company has a compliance function. Doesn't have to be a financial services firm. Companies have privacy rules they have to comply with. They have, think of healthcare, the other very heavily regulated industry, right? But just about any, whether you're Boeing or you're 3M or, there's lots of regulatory requirements that are important and that go to the bottom line of the company if you don't get it right. And it's continuously evolving with technology changes and other things. So I think the compliance function has had a rebirth, not just in financial services, but really kind of across the board in terms of people's expectations.
Very good. Does anyone have a question for Ms. Greco?
Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Jolena, so go ahead.
Hi, Gloria. I'm Jolene Halloran, and I teach it's called Business 255. It prepares students for careers and internships.
Mhm.
And I see that you have a very exceptional career at Merrill Lynch, 42 years.
Mhm.
And these days, that's unheard of. In a lot of articles that I read, and as well as with my boys who just graduated and attained full-time positions, most of them just stay at a company between 1 to 3 years.
Right.
So what are your thoughts and feelings about this new generation that are continually job hopping? Do you think that they should stay a little bit longer to get a little bit more experience? Like, what do you recommend for new students entering the workforce?
It's a great question, and I thank you for the question. I get that question a lot, actually. I have some informal mentees and some formal mentees, that have asked me at times, I've only been here 2 years. Can I, but I really feel like I've kind of maxed out on what I know here, but is it going to look bad on my resume, or how's it going to be perceived? Is it going to look like I'm jumping around? And, as an employer, right, a prospective employer looking at that, I think there's generally an understanding that, my career, 42 years at the same company is probably not the norm right now. So I don't think that people expect that you go somewhere and you are there forever. But if you looked at my resume more closely, even though I was at the same company, I moved around. I was on a trajectory where every 2 or 3 years, I kind of felt like, okay, I'd sort of maxed out what I needed to learn here, and I was starting to get a little antsy to want to learn something else. And my experience, internally, was that one job would always kind of lead into the next one. I was able to leverage what I learned before, but have enough in a new role that would, sort of appeal to my intellectual curiosity, right? And have me learn and develop. And so the answer that I would typically give someone is the key to any success is really about your performance in your role, right? There's an expectation within a role that you're in. And the way to get opportunities and the way to get advancement, whether you're internally or you're going externally, is you have to really demonstrate consistently your commitment, your ability to deliver on what the expectations are, right? And that you have a can-do attitude, right? So because people will want to take a chance on you and give you that stretch assignment or give you that next opportunity if you convey that kind of positive outlook, but your money's where your mouth is, right? That you demonstrate that you've had high performance. And I've, had situations in the past where even people on my team, and they would say, well, I've been in this role for 4 years. That person's only been in the role for 2 years. Why did they get that opportunity? And it's, it's a fair question, but I would ask the person to think about, okay, so in that 4 years, what were the ratings versus relative to your peers? Are you performing? Are you raising your hand for extra assignments? Are you showing interest? Are you taking, demonstrating that commitment? Because that is really what's going to make people want to take a chance on you and give you an opportunity. I hope that, and so I guess my summary is, I don't think it's necessary. I do think that moving around more than every 2 years does kind of give somebody a little bit of a, raised eyebrow, like, is this somebody who's just never going to be happy somewhere? So I do hesitate on that, but I would make sure that when people are leaving, they're going to something that is going to be an advancement and something that, feels like it's a positive, constructive development, not running away from where you are. Because if you're just running away, then you really haven't learned what you need to do in that role. So, but it's important to think about what the role you're taking, right? And how does it fit in your path and, what's interesting to you? Because that's
Thank you.
you're happy.
Yeah. Thank you.
And next we have a question from Mason. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. I'm a sophomore at Pace and I'm a marketing major. I just had a question. You said that you switched from Merrill Lynch to Bank of America. I wanted to know what was the hardest part about like transitioning between two different types of banks, and like what are some things you did to help like ease the process of like switching between jobs?
Yeah, and it's a great question. It kind of leads back into the question, the previous question. Interestingly, if you think about it, the reason that Bank of America acquired Merrill Lynch was because Merrill Lynch was having financial problems, and it related to our institutional side of the business that had taken some pretty risky bets, using company assets that didn't go our way. And so there, when the bank acquired Merrill Lynch, there was a healthy skepticism about the internal controls at Merrill Lynch to say, and by the way, by the regulators of Bank of America, kind of a little concerned about what is it that they had taken on, right? The truth is, we had very robust framework. We weren't the only bank that had some of the problems, but there was some things in the ecosystem beyond even Merrill Lynch about the regulatory framework and environment that failed, right? And Merrill Lynch got caught up in that along with others. But it was a very small piece of our business, but it had an outsized impact. So when the bank acquired Merrill Lynch, there was no way that regardless of what level you were at or what level of experience you had, it was highly unlikely that you were going to be put into a leadership position if you were a Merrill Lynch employee when functions were being combined with Bank of America. So Bank of America had a wealth management business before it acquired Merrill Lynch, as an example. And so I ended up working for someone who had basically the role that I had when I retired, which was the head of wealth management, compliance, and risk. And when I went to work for her, she had somebody who was a trusted person on her team who had some experience that I ended up working for. And, he was a wonderful person, had a lot of great experience, but he certainly hadn't had the experience of managing some of the things that we were dealing with at the scale that Merrill Lynch had versus what Bank of America had. But I knew then that I wasn't really in a position to be making a fuss about that, right? My job at that time was to help him understand what the differences were and what the risks were and what the issues are. And frankly, to make him be successful in his role so that I could be successful in my role, right? Because without his support, I wasn't going to go anywhere, And at that time, I was getting lots of inquiries from hedge funds and other, smaller companies about going to be the chief compliance officer. And I thought, given all the risk I just experienced, I didn't really want to go work at a small firm where even though there's, willing to pay you a lot of money, it's because you're taking a lot of personal risk. So I decided to stay and hang out, and do what I could with this gentleman. Well, P.S., that situation only lasted for about a year. He moved on to a different role. I was promoted into his role. And as a result of my being kind of a team player during that period, both he and my boss were my mentors, throughout the rest of the time that I worked at Bank of America until the day I retired. They were two very important constituents that I had. They were great mentors. They were great friends, because I sort of stepped out of myself and said, okay, if I were them looking at me, what would I be expecting, right? So I think, sometimes you have to look at the circumstances and it's not just about you. You have to sort of understand what are factoring into people's thoughts about things. And the company itself was at a very challenging time, right? We had all these capital issues that we had to address, and we had, regulators breathing down our necks and all those other things. So, I had to adapt to that, and I had to, learn to address the banking regulators in a way that resonated with them, right? And I had to learn a lot about what their expectations were and what they like to see. They also were very much of the view, if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. So they expected a lot of documentation that, previously we didn't have to do, to such a great degree. And so it was, so everything from little things like that to more broadly, what were the kinds of things that were going to set their hair on fire? Those are, having to learn those things was critical. And that's why having two people who were accustomed to dealing with the banking regulators as my mentors was really important, because it really helped me, understand and learn that. And somebody actually told me a great story. Actually, the gentleman that I mentioned that I worked for, he gave me a great analogy. And he said, the difference between the two banking regulators and the securities regulators were, the banking regulators were sort of like your parents. They wanted to know what time you're going out, who you're going out with, what time you're going to be home, and who's driving. Securities regulators come into your room, they look in your closet, they do all these other things. So it's just a very different dynamic, in terms of what their focus is. So it was a really good way for me to think about the difference in kind of what their expectations were.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, next we have a question from Robert. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a business management major. I'm a sophomore. My question is, how would you perceive like the current market, being that the jobs market indicates one thing, but then we have the like inflation reports that indicate another, and then the market fluctuates depending upon that report for that month? Like, how would you perceive it right now if you had to?
Another really good question, and if I had the answer, if I had the right answer, let's put it that way, I could tell you what I think, but none of us will know, I guess, until things play out. But I guess, the way I think about it is, this is not rocket science, right? The markets like certainty. They don't like uncertainty. And so when you have all the things that are going on in the world, whether it's political issues, the war in Ukraine, issues between us and China, I mean, just there's a lot of stuff, right? And then you have very positive numbers coming out of certain of the things that you monitor, like consumer price index and job market and things like that. They're sort of almost in conflict, and so the market doesn't know what to make of it. So what that happens is you have a lot of volatility, and you have an opportunity for, you're always going to have some institutional investors who are the ones that really drive a lot of the volatility in the marketplace. Some are of this camp, and some are of the camp that we're not going to have a recession and things are going to be fine. And so I think we're just in for a little bit of a bumpy ride. I saw something yesterday where Janet Yellen, I think, was saying that they're concerned that they still have more to do in terms of increasing the interest rates, and that has a lot of impact on the markets and how investors think about where things are headed. So I think for the rest of this year, we're going to continue to see some bumpiness, and probably even into next year a bit. I read a lot of the materials that I get, both as a client of Merrill Lynch, but also just industry publications, and there's a lot of discussion about the fact that we're likely to see some more interest rate hikes before the end of the year. So I think that's just kind of inevitable.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have a question from Juliana.
Hi. First off, I just want to say thank you for coming to speak with us. I'm Juliana Ruggieri. I'm currently a sophomore majoring in business management, so I have that in common with you. So I was wondering, how did majoring in management help you excel in the career you have today? I know you said before that having a law degree obviously helped with that, but how would you say that kind of shaped you career-wise?
It's a really good question. One I was thinking about actually in getting prepared for this discussion. And on so many different levels, I would say that experience, when I was taking management courses, I'm sure you were taking not just management training, but also, you're taking psych courses and other things, behavioral, psychology and other things. And I think, first of all, let me say that managing people and managing my team was my favorite part of my job, right? I'm still very much in touch with a lot of the people that worked for me. I've mentored and worked with a lot of different people over the course of 42 years. But I would say that it was the most rewarding aspect of my job. And I think that my education really helped me have the framework of understanding of kind of the basic principles and what's really important. And then I think, just through life experience, over time, you start to hone in on, you put some flesh on the bone, so to speak, and you start to learn what works for you with different people. And one of the most important things I learned was that not everybody's motivated the same way. So when you're working with people and trying to motivate them, you kind of have to understand a little bit about how their mind works and what their priorities are. And if you can speak to people in a way that comes across as sincere, but is really sort of directed toward what they're interested in or what's their objective, then I think, it's very helpful. I'm a big believer in a lot of open dialogue, right? And just keeping those communications open. And even if it's unpleasant, I had a business partner who I adored, who had this phrase, I'm going to drive right up to it, and I'm just going to ask you the tough question, or I'm going to say the thing that is on my mind. And I, sometimes it was a little rough when it landed, but it actually helped open the door to some really good conversations. So I learned that, as long as you're addressing somebody, even if it's criticism, you're addressing someone with sincerity and empathy, it goes a long way to making it a constructive conversation. And sometimes people aren't ready to hear it, right? And so there's always going to be some conversations that don't quite go as well as you'd like. But I would say for the most part, by and large, I felt like having a connection with people, in that dialogue was really the critical thing. So I think that education, the degree in management has multi-purpose. It really kind of has a lot of applications, whether you're a leader of people or you're part of an organization.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have a question from Pulkit.
Hi, Gloria. Thank you for coming here. I'm double masters in finance and marketing analytics,
Okay.
and I'm doing this from PACE. But yeah, my question is that you said it earlier on that we, as a bank, when you were working in Bank of America, you have to put some capital as a reserve to protect from the losses, even though the security regulators won't like it. So when something like this happen, and I know it could be a challenging one, so how will you address it, and what should one learn from these kind of issues?
It's interesting. And just to make sure I was clear, the securities regulators also had requirements about how much capital you had to reserve, right? You had to have at least as much as a multiple of the client deposits that you had on hand. So all of our clients' assets, let's say they equaled $100, we had to have $150 in capital reserved, right? There's some calculations, but the banking regulators, and frankly, it's not just banking regulators now, there are layers of these capital requirements that now apply against different type of assets and the age of assets and the riskiness of assets and other things. And actually I had a colleague, brilliant executive that I worked with, that made a spider web that kind of mapped out all these different regulatory requirements around capital. And it was fascinating. But so I guess the thing that I learned, though, and here's the lesson learned, was a lot of things that you've probably seen in the paper of things that impacted not just Bank of America, but the whole financial services industry over the last 10 plus years. They're not rocket science, right? They're kind of obvious in a way, but the regulatory regime and companies kind of operate to comply with the rules that exist. And we spend a lot of time also thinking about, okay, even if the rule doesn't say we must do X, what's the right thing to do, and what should we do, right? But you'll see that places where there was a vacuum around, specific regulatory requirements, that gray area is where the mischief happens. Because you have lots of different players with different risk appetites, some of whom are willing to say, yeah, I don't care about that, I'm just going to go do this, right? You have others that maybe have tipped their toe in the water, but they're not quite all in, but they get caught up, right, in what happens. So I think the lesson I learned was you have to sort of take a step back, and it was the source of a lot of robust debate and discussion with my business partners about, okay, the rule doesn't say we can't do that, but do we feel like that's something we really want to do? Because even that's what, if we say now that it's okay, like how would I defend that to a client or to a regulator or to a litigant, in a dispute? How would I defend what we did or didn't do? And that was always the should conversation. And that's where the risk management piece came in versus just the compliance piece, right? Because compliance is all about complying with the regulations that exist. Risk management is a little broader than that, right? Because you're gonna have losses, even if you're complying, you'd still have losses because of those types of things. So it's always, keeping an eye on not just the letter of the law or, what the bare minimum is, but how could this go wrong? The chief risk officer at the bank had this phrase. He always says, what are all the ways I can win? He was a bond trader, right, before in one of his earlier roles. And he said, what are all the ways I could win and what are all the ways I could lose? Like you should always go into an endeavor, with that view, because that, you have to try to think ahead and make your decision accordingly.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, next we have a question from Tim. Go ahead.
Hi, Mrs. Greco. I'm Timothy Kozlowski. I'm a sophomore and I'm a business management major. I know you said that it's hard to have those deep conversations, but is there any other important aspects of your job that you find hard that you were not expecting?
I think those feedback conversations with an unwilling participant were always challenging. But I would say one thing I want to share with you is, a lot of the work that I did also, especially in probably the last 5 years of my career, I spent a lot of time on diversity and inclusion and equity initiatives in a leadership role, driving programs, at the company level and then in our division in the risk management organization. And, we had a lot of really great momentum, right? And a lot of really good activity. And I think that one thing that I learned a lot, like during COVID, when the George Floyd situation occurred, I think it was a giant wake-up call for a lot of people. And I think even though we were doing a lot of really good things, long before then, I don't know whether it was just how horrendous that particular situation was or coupled on top of all the other situations that have occurred. But I also think that people feeling vulnerable at a time during COVID when everybody was working from home and there was all this uncertainty and everything else, I think it really, in a positive way, actually engendered a lot of dialogue on a much more personal level that never would have occurred absent that. And I have to say, it was among the most rewarding things that I did as I finished out my career at the bank, because I spent a lot of time really understanding on a whole different level, kind of what people were experiencing and how they were experiencing, and basic things like the importance of representation and just a whole lot of things, and I used to have these monthly conversations, for example, with different groups of my team, right, at different levels, and we would talk about D&I topics, and I would have them, pick a topic, and we would just sort of have an open dialogue about it. I learned so much just by listening, and they felt heard, and I could then take what I heard from them and use it to influence management's thinking about how we were going to approach certain things. So I guess the big lesson or takeaway for me was, it's not enough just to manage people. You really have to do your best to really kind of meet them where they are and understand what makes them tick, and bottom line is treat everyone with respect, right? And take the time to listen, because it's really important, and I think really engendered a lot of momentum for us, so I feel good about that.
Thank you.
Please put your questions in the chat, or just raise your hand like you've been doing. Let me follow on, if I could, to the last question about people and all that. How did you go about building teams, people who work for you, when you were going to hire somebody and you look at a bunch of resumes, not revenues? How'd you go about selecting the teams? To what extent did DEI drive your decisions, and how'd you go about it?
It's a great question, and I guess it kind of goes a little bit back to the first question too about I kind of had a philosophy that I would rather hire somebody who was really high performing and know that they were only willing to hang out with me for 2 years, but I would have them for that 2 years and know that and prepare them to move on, than to have somebody who was less qualified, who was willing to hang out for 5 years, And so I guess I was always looking for a little bit of a spark in people. And we used to do a lot of group interviews and multiple round interviews. So I would ask people who I knew were good sort of talent spots, to help me with the interview process, to look for some of the things that I mentioned, people who have a positive outlook, who have an intellectual curiosity, who are willing to learn, who want to, take on new challenges, things like that. And one of the things that I get asked a lot too about skills, that's really important. And one thing about law school that was beneficial, but I don't think law school, in fact, I took a really great public speaking course at Lubin years ago, and even an assertiveness training course, I will add, way back when. But being able to articulate your point of view in a concise and clear way and convey confidence is critical. So regardless of whether you're having a conversation, for an entry level role, or you're dealing, at a much more senior level, being able to convey confidence without arrogance, but confidence is really important. But the other skill that's really important is writing skills. And I have to tell you, see a lot of students come out of school not really able to write well. And it's a little disappointing, and it actually hurts them because their inability to write clearly and concisely and in a grammatically correct way reflects negatively on them and loses their message. So I would say if you feel like writing's not one of your skills, that's a place you want to focus, because it really makes a difference. Even, at a senior level, if I had to write a memo to the chief risk officer or to the board, I had to be able to write that. And the people who were preparing drafts for me, had to be able to write it, because I wasn't going to spend all my time rewriting it, so it's just, you have to, it's a basic skill, but it's really critical. And I think because we've gotten so accustomed to, email and texting and other things that are kind of shorthand ways to communicate, we sort of forget that in a more formal setting, and I had a great story. I had a boss who I worked for, who was a great mentor, and I would prepare things for her that I knew she would get questions from the board or other people. So I would prepare the first draft that she could then send along to executive management or the board. And I remember one time I wrote this email that I felt really laid out all the information that was important, but it was several paragraphs long. And she knew that there was no way that the people at that level were going to read several paragraphs. So she basically picked out, she put on top of my email, 2 or 3 lines that basically summarized everything I had, this very long email. And when I saw it, she copied me on it when she sent it along. And I thought, oh my God, that is a real skill. And I said to her, like, how did you learn to do that? And she said, well, you're a cook. Think of it like a sauce reduction. Only pick out the things that really add flavor. And I was like, what a great analogy. But so being able to really crisply and concisely convey the important facts and do it in a way that's engaging and kind of gets people's attention is really a critical skill.
Okay, we have another question from Mason.
Hi again. My question was, when managing like teams or groups, how do you deal with like employees that aren't either listening to what you're saying or giving you a hard time in terms of like the work?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would just say there's one in every crowd, I mean, we had a framework for performance evaluations that was done on a relative basis. And what that does is, what I mean by that is, if you had 10 people, only 2 people could get an exceeds expectations rating, and 2 people had to get a less than meets rating. And everybody else was kind of lumped in the middle, okay? And that doesn't mean that everybody along that spectrum couldn't stand some feedback about how they could be even better. Even the people who were exceeds, always, there was always room for improvement, I would say, even for myself. But the people in the middle, I always felt was really important, because they had the greatest chance of getting to the exceeds, and I wanted to invest my time and energy with them. But I would be lying if I didn't say that what I actually ended up spending most of my time on were the people at the lower end, because they demanded more time. And it was never wasted, because I have seen situations where, with the right level of engagement and support and direct, feedback and oversight, I have seen people kind of move up the scale, and significantly improve. But I think as a manager, you're constantly balancing that. And I really tried to be very deliberate about spending more of my time with the people who, not to say I wouldn't give feedback or give any time to the people at the bottom end, but, it's a partnership, and if you want to have a job and you want to get paid, then you have to do the job we've asked you to, and you've got to do it well. And, like many other companies, the bank had a policy where, if you didn't meet, you didn't get your bonus, and after a period of time of giving you the opportunity to correct things, if that didn't work, then you were gone. So, I think the most critical thing, though, you can do, as I said earlier, is be really sincere and direct with somebody about what it is that they're doing or not doing that is creating the problem for them and impeding their ability to be performing, at a level that they probably could perform, or to improve their performance. So I think it's having that very direct, driving up to it conversation about, look, this is what I'm seeing, giving them a chance to explain, right? Sometimes there are I had a really disappointing scenario with one individual who worked for me for a number of years, who was a phenomenal talent, but he was having some personal issues and his performance was suffering as a result of that. And it wasn't until I finally, kind of said to him, look, this is, we've had this conversation now a couple of times and it's not getting better. We're going to have to move in a different direction here. You may have to separate from us if we don't see improvement. And then he finally told me what was going on with him, and I was able to help him get some help. And happy to say that, that it worked out for the better, but it wasn't until we kind of had that head-to-head conversation. I think he felt like he could continue to sort of, he was so caught up in the issues that he was having that he didn't understand how others were perceiving what was going on. He thought he was kind of getting by and he wasn't. And I had to tell him, and it was hard. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but I was glad because he felt like he was supported then, because I got him help and we supported him and gave him a chance to turn it around. But it's challenging.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And we have another question from Robert.
I really like what you said about people and basically constructive confrontation, because I find that institutions and organizations are pretty black and white, but then once you add the people into it, that's where the gray areas about and come up. And excuse the question if it's audacious. My mom also, she works in Treasury. Well, she worked at Treasury at Avon for over 25 years. And her being a woman in corporate in America, she faced a lot of, and a Black woman, she faced a lot of disparities and, just microaggressions and different things like that. So I was wondering if you had any, let me find the word, any experiences, I guess you can say, where you kind of said, oh, like, as a woman, or if you, like you said, people on your team, if, they were working with someone maybe who is, of like a minority community, maybe like with the racial wealth gap or anything like that, like you experience anything as it pertains to racial or gender-based disparities?
Yeah, well, I would say for sure. I started working in 1980 on Wall Street, and that was when they still had boom boom rooms and strippers on the trading floor and all kinds of crazy stuff that went on. Not necessarily at Merrill Lynch, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had. But I certainly experienced situations where, I would be presenting on something, and a gentleman would be sitting next to me presenting, and he would say the same thing I just said, and everybody would turn to him at what he said. Right. And so I got lost in that conversation. And those are small things, but and frankly, I think working in the legal department was a little bit of a help there too, because there the law, it's very black and white, and I mean in the sense that it's objective, right? You either know the law or you don't, and versus like a sales role where it's all dependent on relationships and things like that, which are much harder to navigate when there's inherent bias and other things at play. So that was helpful, but I certainly felt that. But I will say that one experience that I had, so I'm a gay woman, and so being, out at work was a really big deal for me. And initially I wasn't, and I had a boss who was a general counsel at the time, and we had another woman on our team who was gay, and her partner of many, many years died of cancer. And that general counsel sent around an email to everyone. This was the custom at the time, was to send out a notification to say, sorry to tell you that so-and-so, passed away, and here's the services, and here's where you can mail a card or whatever. And he treated her loss just like as if it was her husband, or, like for anybody else. And to me, that was so meaningful that he kind of set the standard then, right? He set the tone that this is how we're going to treat this, because we need to respect the impact on this person and her life, and just like it would be for anybody else. And I think observing things like that, and this is where representation and things, come into play, made it more comfortable for me to, I wasn't out telling the world about it, but, made it more comfortable for me to talk about my spouse and, our life, and in a way that I might not have. And I've had people, actually somebody on my team right before I retired, said to me, because I was so willing to talk about that, it made them a lot more comfortable, being out at work when he hadn't been. And I've had, lots of other people tell me that as well. So I guess the point is, we all come to work. We used to like to say, we bring our whole selves to work, and you do in a way, right? Because nobody's a monolith. Everybody has different experiences and different things that influence how they work. But, it's hard to overcome sometimes the predisposed ideas about, how somebody operates and what's important to them. So, I have experienced that, but I'm happy to say that, for the most part, with a lot of perseverance, and, you do what you have to, make your voice heard and move forward.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
You've been obviously a very successful executive. Would you tell people what your typical day was like?
Sure.
I'm sure it's busy, but what was it like? Yeah.
Yeah, and especially, during COVID when we were working at home, I mean, I would somehow the days would start at, 6:30 or 6:45 in the morning. I'd be on my first calls all the way up until, 7:30 at night. And, I would come run out and get some coffee and run back into my little office. But, I guess I would say I would break it up this way. I spent a lot of time with my business partners, in meetings talking about, different growth initiatives that they had, or product launches that they wanted to do, or structural changes that they wanted to make in their organizations, and just advising them on, what the risks might be and how to manage that. So I spent a good chunk of my time with business partners, and whether it was, formal committee meetings where I was a voting member, or if it was just, business meetings to talk about different initiatives, those are the things I'd be involved in. And that would probably take up about 60%, maybe 70%, depending on the day. When it was PPP, it was like 100%. But that would take up a good chunk of the day. And then there would be routines with my leadership team, whether it was with them one-on-one or with them as a group. We had regular routine meetings every week that I would have with them to talk about stuff that was going on within our team, and how we were, different initiatives that we had around people management and hiring, and our budget, and D&I initiatives, and performance evaluations and so forth. So there was that amount of time. And then we had a bunch of stuff that we would do because we were a compliance and risk function, that there were very programmatic things that we had to do to be able to evidence the framework that we followed in our oversight of the business. So we would do very formalized, documented risk assessments of every component of the business, both the inherent risk, the control, an assessment of the control environment, and the residual risk. And all of that would be used by us and by the business to identify areas where they needed to improve their controls, or where we needed to add testing, or maybe we needed to add resources to focus on different parts of the business. So we would spend time, reviewing those materials and reviewing the results of assessments and things of that ilk. And then, of course, I would have meetings that I participated in with my boss and executive management in the risk organization. And at the enterprise level, there were routines that the CEO and his direct reports had that I would participate in to talk about strategic initiatives and other things. And then, part of that would also be board meetings, whether for different legal entities or, for Bank of America Corporation. So I would participate in some of those routines, and those were really useful because that took me out of my sort of day-to-day, wealth management focus and my team focus, and sort of helped me see how we fit into the larger organization globally, right? And different things that were going on around the world. So for example, when the US government decided to impose sanctions on Chinese companies that were associated with the Chinese military, that was a big initiative globally that we had to get involved in, to make sure that around the world, we were able to comply with those sanctions. And we were advising clients who were investors, wealth management clients who were investors in those securities, and working with the trading side to make sure that they could help ensure that any of the transactions that we effectuated for clients, got done appropriately, but within compliance with the sanctions. So I would say, depending on what was going on, those percentages would fluctuate about what I was doing on a given day. But I would say the most part, and, a lot of the things that I spent most of my time on were either with the business or with my team, and those were equally rewarding for different reasons.
You had your hands in a lot of things, obviously. Sounds like a really wonderful career, no question. Well, our hour has come to an end, I'm sorry to say. It's gone by very fast. I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today, very much. Obviously, there's a lot of interest among the students and others who attended this. We have a small token of appreciation. Unfortunately, I can't hand it to you through the camera.
Right.
It'll be sent to your home. Look for that in a few days. And I want to thank you again and thank everybody on the call for joining us today for this Dean's Roundtable. Have a
Great.
great
Thank
rest of your
you.
day,
Thank
everybody.
you so much, everyone. Be well.